Okay. Okay, well, hello everyone. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us today. So let me start by introducing myself. I'm Kristof Savski. I'm an assistant professor of linguistics at the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Prince of Songkla University, which is in Hat Yai in the south of Thailand, if you right next to the border with Malaysia. And I'm very pleased to welcome you at this online symposium on key issues in language and development, hosted by our wonderful Faculty of Liberal Arts. You're not here, none of you are here except me in let's say, with your body, but you are here with your mind, and I'm very, very happy that you've taken some time to join us today. Okay, let me just start by introducing what the whole event is about. Okay, so I think sort of the background of this event really is obviously us realizing with a bit of a delay once COVID hit that we have these wonderful technologies that allow us to meet online and to share our knowledge online. But also, I think as part of kind of a broader search, for ways that we can open up academic discussion, new ways to open up academic discussion with people that, you know, maybe in traditional academic conferences, we haven't managed to reach, and or at times that we haven't managed to speak, and basically to try and kind of bring our academic work a little bit closer to the real world at times. So the topic for today's symposium is key issues in language and development. And basically that's kind of, I think, something that brings all of us five here together. We're all, we have a sort of common interest in phenomena that are happening in what we would usually consider as developing societies in Asia.
Excuse me, Kristof, several
yes,
people.
I see there are people saying no sound. If you don't have sound, please check whether you clicked connect to audio, which is on the bottom left of your Zoom, I believe that if you don't have sound, please do check. There are quite a few of you here at the bottom which are not connected to the audio, okay? So do check that. You have to click connect to audio and then connect to dial in. Oh yeah, but if you don't have sound, then you cannot hear me. But anyway, okay, now we're talking about developing societies, okay? So this is, of course, important to say from the start, that we do, I think, here all see development as quite a complex process, as something that has very, very sort of very different aspects, not simply as a period of growth, as it's often seen that, you know, we start off as a sort of, let's say, low-income economy and we end up being a high-income economy. That's how development is often seen in this sort of economic way. We really are thinking here of it, I think, as a social, political, cultural process of transformation. And our interest, of course, is in language. We're all applied linguists or sociolinguists here. I think we all identify with one or both of those fields. So we're thinking about questions like, what language should be used to help develop a society, or what languages? How should language function in that sort of society? You know, stereotypical question, do we need a particular national language, or can we have multiple languages? And if we have multiple languages, how do we arrange them? How do we sort of govern the relationships between them? So we've sort of, the five of us have sort of come together to talk about five different issues. We've got a big topic, which we're going to start with, is the question of social conflict, which Giolo Bianco is going to talk about, the issue of maintaining and revitalizing languages, which Prof. Stefanie Pillai will talk about. Then we've got the question of inequality, and we're very lucky to have Ruanni Tupas from Uni College London to talk about that. And the question of migration, incredibly relevant to the modern world, where we've got Tony Capstick and then myself at the end to talk about global language policies. Now, before we start, just to talk about the practicalities, each of the speakers is going to speak for about 15 minutes. We really do welcome questions and comments. Now, if you do have a question while someone is speaking, you're very welcome to write it in the chat box, yeah, and I'll be following that. And once there is quite a few questions, we might turn to them for a few minutes. But we will also have a discussion time at the end. So if you do want to contribute by switching on your microphone and speaking to us, that is also you're very welcome to do that. Oh, and the other thing that I wanted to say, if it does happen that you know, unexpected things happen and your internet drops, you have to leave, you have to go somewhere, I am recording this and it will be on YouTube as soon as we can possibly put it there. So if you do have to leave at some point, you'll be able to pick up afterward, okay? I think that's enough for the practicalities, yeah? And let's start with start with our first speaker. So our first speaker, we're very lucky to have Professor Joe Bianco, who is Emeritus Professor of Language and Literacy Education at the University of Melbourne. And in the past, he was also President of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Joe is primarily, I think, an expert in language policy, yeah. He's author of a really great number of scholarly publications. And aside from that, in 1987, he was also the author of the Australian National Policy on Languages. And he's worked very extensively as a language policy consultant in a number of contexts all over the world, including Sri Lanka, Timor-Leste, my country, Slovenia, yeah, also Papua New Guinea, and many others. Most recently, in 2011, 2017, he was in charge of 3-country language and peace building initiative for UNICEF. And this took place in Malaysia, Myanmar, and Thailand. And this is the work where he really highlighted a topic that's really key to the interest of this symposium on language and development, which is conflict. We can see a lot of conflicts where language plays a key role, no less the current very horrible war going on in the Ukraine, where language plays or is claimed to play a big role. Yeah. So I think that is a really good starting point for our symposium today. So Prof. Joe, let me share my screen. Okay.
While the screen sharing is happening, I'll just like to start by greeting everyone, my fellow panelists particularly, but all the participants as well. Thank you for sparing this time. And I want to emphasize something that Kristof just said, that although I'm going to be focusing on Southeast Asia, the question of language and conflict is really a global problem. Historically, and it's associated to a large extent with the formation of nations and national states, because nations and national states prefer an exclusive single language. This is sometimes described, I think incorrectly, as a Eurocentric problem. If you look at the historical establishment of states in many parts of the world, you find something very similar to it. It's associated with Europe, particularly because of the century of nationalism, the 19th century, and then its export through colonial practices and imperialism. But it is actually a universal well, perhaps not universal, certainly widespread. So Kristof, if we could move the slide, please. So the context in which all of our discussion takes place is a recognition by the international community that a category of languages, in fact, the majority of human languages, are in a very different situation from all other languages. They lack the protection of a national state. They lack the protection of institutions. They're marginalized in the delivery of education. They're called non-dominant and sometimes indigenous languages. But these are about 70% of the total number of human languages that are actually in danger, and it's a very important context. I won't be able to talk about this very much, but it's important to mention that this is the backdrop, an agreed United Nations decade devoted to revitalization of endangered languages. And that's very, very pertinent to the question of conflict and cohesion that I'm going to be addressing. Next slide, please. So the recent focus of my work, and I believe my colleague Fethi Hilal from Tunisia is online, and if so, greetings to him. We're doing similar work to some of this in relation to Tunisia, a wonderful project he has been leading on documenting discourses of language within that nation. My own work has been with a strong focus and interest in literacy, because I think literacy has been unfortunately far too neglected in language policy work, and in especially literacy in relation to its connection with multilingualism in developing multilingual nations. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by developing nations in a moment. Another area of focus is the link between the history of language policy and the problem which developed in the United States, North America in particular, and was regarded as an autonomous, neutral practice, and how it applies in societies where there is either arrested economic development and therefore poverty and considerable multilingualism, but also dependency through aid and development. And very few scholars in sociolinguistics or language planning or language education look at questions of aid and development. And that's a great pity, because it's a very important practice in the world. I've got a paper coming out later this year looking at that and critiquing our field for not addressing it properly, because people tend to focus really within nation states, and we really ought to look at influences that spread across, as some of the other speakers are going to do, or all of them, I think. Then the question of the appropriate language policy focus in developing multilingual contexts, which have a high need for literacy, but especially in post-colonial settings that are suffering subnational conflicts. Kristof was right to mention Ukraine. It is exactly like other situations, but it has its own particularities of subnational language issues, and I won't be able to talk about that today, of course. And then the question of how unequal language and literacy achievements through schooling in multi-ethnic, multilingual developing countries contribute to conflict, and that's going to be the bulk of what I talk about. So next slide, please. So I approach this through the lens of peace building and reconciliation in conflict-affected settings, and the question of multilingual rights. When we look at it, over time, I've concluded that we can identify two language connections with conflict, and conflict here means the erosion of social cohesion. And these are fast-acting effects and slow-acting effects. And fast-acting effects come from verbal repudiation of people, usually through hate speech or exclusionary language, or images of national belonging that exclude explicitly some groups of people, that actively throw them out of the civic life of the society. And the slow acting effect, which is always ignored, unfortunately, by language scholars as a conflict inducing reality, is unequal achievements in education, particularly through literacy policy, but also through lack of mother tongue teaching and first language support in schools, which at least one other scholar is going to address today, who's going to speak later. So the next slide, please. So if you could just keep in mind this distinction between a slow acting effect and a fast acting effect. Now, when we look at development and we use the term development, I think we can distinguish many different meanings of this in the literature. When I look at it, and I've simplified these a bit, I think there are two general approaches, and Kristof mentioned this a moment ago. There's basically what I'm going to call approach A and approach B. And approach A is a way of looking at development that is concerned with progressive increases in prosperity. Growing prosperity is measured against an index of growth, that is expansion of economic capability every year. And reduction of poverty is a feature of this approach, but the focus is mostly growth. And this approach often has lags, what they call lags, that long periods of time between which the promised economic development doesn't actually arrive, and more people become poor and marginalized. And this tends to be associated with neoliberal economics, which look at fundamentally indicators of economic growth expressed in gross domestic product measures. Approach B is concerned with development in terms of human dignity, potential, and flourishing. And it obviously includes economic development, but it's not premised on it exclusively. So poverty reduction is not a general goal on its own, but it's tied to overcoming the inequalities between groups, races, regions, classes, and other categories in society. This approach to development places an emphasis on equality, enhanced opportunity, and social change. And it addresses health, education, social, and political participation alongside economic measures of development. So it's important to we keep in mind the concept I've offered already of fast-acting and slow-acting effects, and also these two approaches to development, which I'm just calling approach A and approach B. Next slide, please, Kristof. So this division is a simplification, of course, but it is a useful basis for discussion for our topic today. The distinction is important because B changes A, that is, this much wider approach doesn't exclude the growth of prosperity, increases in prosperity, but it's much more expansive than that. And pursuing development through different strategies, the ones imposed by B, takes us away from economic factors and includes important questions like human symbolism, human dignity, equality, etc. B also enhances what we might call factor mobility, which many studies of stagnant economic growth models show these hold back plans to focus on development in Model A. So B doesn't preclude the approach of A, it just goes much further. Next one, please. So how do we understand language? I'm just not going to talk very much about this because I think most of you are involved with language studies, but I do want to say that my field of work, language policy and planning, for much of its life regarded multilingualism as producing poverty. There were many studies done in the 60s and 70s that when Japan was taking off as an economic powerhouse and saying, look, Japan is monolingual, and just like the United States, which is monolingual, there is economic growth there. Multilingual societies like in India are poor, and then they drew a connection between the multilingualism and the poverty. Now, none of the connections in what I've just told you can be justified through sociological or economic data, certainly not now and not even then. But it was believed that there was a direct relationship between multilingualism and poverty. And this was among language policy scholars. And so in developing country contexts, they would give advice to governments around approach A kinds of development, with the assumption that monolingualism, a single state language, a single high-level literacy, was necessary for economic development. And many countries, post-colonial societies, bought into this idea. Sometimes they recovered internal thinking of their own that was monolingual, and other times they bought it from an external source that was providing economic aid. The next one, please, Kristof. So if we look at multilingualism development, and I'm jumping quite a few steps here because I'm assuming that you will accept my assumption, which we can prove empirically now, that there is no direct connection between multilingualism and economic performance, and certainly not poverty, but we can prove that there is a direct connection between the repression of multilingualism and social conflict, and the repression of multilingualism in schools and poverty for some groups of people. And these are really important developments because they buy into the logic of decision-making in governments. I might have to go a bit quicker to get through my talk in the 15 minutes, Kristof. So I might just say on this slide that the vision that I'm putting forward of a new kind of language planning that reinforces multilingualism and development is one that we have to put a lot of effort into to overcome many years of denying both of these elements. That is approach B and multilingualism. So next slide, please. I think we'll skip this one, actually. Now, in some of the work that I've done, Kristof mentioned the National Policy on Languages, which I wrote for Australia in 1987. We started to develop some of these ideas, or I started to develop some of these ideas within Australia, which of course is considered a developed country. But this is where I want to argue that developed societies often have large developing contexts within them. So we can't just directly fit single countries into the developed, undeveloped categories. It doesn't work like that. Even developing countries, as they are widely understood, often have extremely wealthy, privileged elites who are part of an international horizontal network of prosperity and prestige. So we can't lose sight of class differentiation within societies. And in developed societies, we find, like among Indigenous people in Australia, extremely, indicators of poverty and health that are very much like what we find in countries that are classified as developing in their totality. So I think we should avoid categorizing entire countries exclusively one way or the other. And this was developed in a book that was that I edited, actually, called Voices from Phnom Penh on Development and Language, which was from a Language and Development Conference in 2001 in Cambodia, and then looked at in relation to a new vision of language policy in what we called Australian policy activism in that same year. So I'm happy to talk to people about these if you're interested. Next slide, please, Kristof. These references, which I'm happy to share with you, are about the studies that were done in Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, and Malaysia. And I'll just skip them. They'll be available for you if you're interested when you receive the slides. The next slide, please. So what we find when we look at research on primary school aged children produced by UNICEF and UNESCO on a mass scale, very large numbers of children, including actually in developed societies, who attend school for relatively long periods of time, even 4 or 5 years, and actually do not attain the literacy rates that allow them to go to secondary school or to continue from secondary school into university. So this is why classifications that are categorical and say this society is in this category are really not very helpful, because we find children like this all around the world. And what it tells us is that there's something more than economic development going on. It's about language of instruction. This is very clear when we look at who are the children that are failing to proceed. They tend to be indigenous minority children, rural and isolated children. In some societies, it tends to be girls over boys. At some levels of schooling, it tends to be boys over girls, depending on what the labor market offers. And you can obviously break this down according to economic criteria and language. What this basically tells us is that we must pay much more attention, looking at literacy, because as we can see, many children actually go to school for relatively long periods of time and do not achieve levels of literacy that allow them to go on. So it's not attendance at schooling alone that explains this. Next slide, please. Okay, look, I might skip this one, Kristof, and because I'm just concerned about I don't want to take time from my colleagues. When we look at the Southeast Asian context, we see that there are at least, according to this study by the Asia Foundation, 26 subnational conflicts. And in these conflicts, language, minority language as a grievance is often present. So this is very disturbing when we consider that sociologists and development studies people, economists, my first degree was in economics, and I'm often shocked at how few of my economic colleagues and peers never pay any attention to language, like it's a completely siloed experience. And yet when we go and look at conflicts in historical time and in economic reality, we see that language issues overlap with class and ethnicity and indigeneity, and that these are the sources of conflict in the two kinds of ways I mentioned before, through the slow acting effect of intergenerational poverty and the fast acting effect of abuse and speech that's directed at minority populations by elite and prestige groups. Next slide, please. And we see that this is often misunderstood. For example, these two political scientists writing about the same society, that is Sri Lanka, and the conflicts, the communal conflicts that took place over a longish period of time there, came to completely different conclusions about the role of language. William Bostock identified the term language grief and looked at the grievances of some populations and said that language grief and was a pervasive source of conflict in Sri Lanka. But David Layton, studying exactly the same society from a political scientist point of view, said that that language grievances rarely, neither language differences nor grievances lead to violence and conflict. And so, you know, there is no consensus along this, and that's because people tend to have a very shrunken view of what language is. So the next slide, please, and then I'll just finish soon after that. So what we find here is that people advising developing country societies, often, you know, using prescriptions that come from what's called the Washington Consensus of Economic Development, which is more productivity, cheaper goods, export orientation, borrowing money strategically, etc. That and these kinds of forms of advice often overwhelm the sovereign power of developing countries to make their own decisions, to make their own mistakes, and the neglect of the conflict that's based on both social class and ethnic differences. So language oppression leads to language grievances, and poor language policy that fails large numbers of children, and especially in my argument, poor language and literacy policies that lead to intergenerational poverty and unemployment that are a factor in language and conflict, in eroding social cohesion. I'm not going to argue that they're an exclusive factor by any means. There are often religious and other questions involved, but it is significantly misunderstood and underrepresented. Next slide, please. I'm going to finish in just one moment. Look, I'll just say that this is further evidence. I won't talk about this, but further evidence that the world's most dynamic economies, the locus of the world's economic energy in Asia, is also judged by many people, when we go and look at minority populations, to be experiencing an education crisis. And it's a crisis not of the absence of good universities or good scholars or good teachers, but of inequality, and often colonially inherited and continued by policies that basically mirror what were in place under a previous regime. So the next slide, please. Look, this is some work that I've been doing with the National Unity government, the legitimate government of Myanmar, elected before the coup took place last February last year of 2021. I won't be able to talk about this, but it just strongly reinforces the same kinds of arguments that I'm making for a combination of class analysis with ethnic and language analysis. The next slide, please. And this is Professor Suilai Premsrirat from Mahidol University in Thailand, arguing about the south of Thailand, effectively the same kind of question that the Muslim Malays in the south, or Malay speakers in the south of Thailand, who often don't speak Thai and underperform in the Thai education system and don't go on to higher education. And as a result, she's combining here exactly the same points I've been making. They face problems finding work, which makes it easier for young people to be drawn into conflict. And so we see the combination of a language policy, its economic effects, and social cohesion being eroded. Next slide, please. Look, I might skip that because that just basically, I think I've already said what I wanted to say in relation to that one. And I might skip this one too, but I recommend it to you. This is a model of thinking about multilingualism put forward earlier this year by some scholars based mostly on Southeast Asian public policy analysis, linking what they call a national language, vernacular languages, and an international language. And they're grasping, or searching rather, for a solution to a model in language policy that can actually respond to both of these needs. And the next slide, please. And I just wanted to quote my own PhD student who did study on the Orang Asli indigenous students in Malaysia, very similar kinds of investigation with the need to learn standard Malay, Bahasa Melayu, and the need to Learn English, or the requirement to learn English in the system, and therefore the pressure against the mother tongues of these students, which even though they're recognized in some ministry statements, these other pressures tend to push them out. There are literacy underperformance issues involved, and these children are marginalized from schooling. And Surya's research is very current on exactly this issue. Next slide, please. I might skip that. It's the same argument there that Surya makes. And I just wanted to conclude with this slide, that what we're talking about then is a form of integrated language planning at family, school, and community levels that reinforces multilingualism within a social cohesion lens that looks at overcoming the grievances and inequalities that bad language policy, unjust language policy produces by generating intergenerational inequality, which is something that all societies in the world need to devote themselves to much, much more energetically than they have. I think that's my last slide. I'm sorry if I've gone a bit over time. Thank you very much, Kristof, for your patience. And I'm happy to share these slides. I'll make some changes before I send them to Kristof, and he can put them up on the site. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think that was a great introduction to the whole symposium, really. I think you really sort of took a great view there. And I think it's led us really well to the next topic, which is about language revitalization. So we've seen here that developing societies often end up with unequal relationships between languages, or rather unequal relationships between people, yeah, if we're quite precise, yeah. And that often leads to languages ending up on the edge of survival. And Prof. Stefanie Pillai is, I think, the perfect person to talk to us about this. She is a professor at the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics, Universiti Malaya, formerly also dean of that faculty. And she's currently dean with a marvelous title. She is the dean of the Social Advancement and Happiness Research Cluster at Universiti Malaya. And she has a very broad range of academic work. I just saw that she started with psycholinguistic research on speech disfluencies way back in history. But more recently, she's worked, for example, on phonetics of Malaysian English. But really, I think her sort of most notable focus, and I think what she identifies with most strongly, is the question of language use in multilingual societies, and especially language documentation and revitalization, where her work has really looked especially at Malacca Portuguese, which is one of these languages in Southeast Asia, which has been which has been, well, not nice to say, a loser in the development process to some extent. So a language which has definitely suffered. So I think that is a really great continuation. So Prof. Stefanie, let me stop sharing the slides here.
Thank you.
And Prof. Stefanie, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Kristof. Let me just try to share my slides and let's see. Okay, give me 1 second. Put it on slideshow. Okay, here we go. Right, it'll take a while before it starts showing up on the screen, I think. Okay, here we go. I hope that you can see it on slideshow. Yes, thank you so much, Kristof. And it's I think it's true. It's nice to follow Joe's talk, because now I can I definitely relate to a lot of things that he has mentioned, and I'll try to also make some links with what I'm going to share with you. In terms of maintaining and revitalizing languages, yeah? So let me just put this out of the way. Okay, all right. So, you know, we always, a lot of times when I talk about language revitalization or documentation, people ask me questions, particularly I get this from a lot of scientists, like, why bother, you know, survival of the fittest. So, you know, when languages, people stop speaking languages, or in a community, there are only a few fluent speakers left, why bother with it, right? And what is it that you're doing anyway? So I'm just gonna share this quote with you, and I think I can share my slides later, so you don't have to take pictures or anything. That it's basically we're looking at activities that are designed to maintain, but also to increase the presence of an endangered or dormant language in a speech community, and maybe, I think more importantly, in the lives of individuals and what it actually means to them in getting back their language and being able to use their language again And I'll share some of the experiences with Malacca Portuguese, which is my maternal heritage language as well. And then when people ask why, I mean, this is something that many of you might have seen, this kind of a documentary on a language that was brought to life again. And, you know, this is the very romantic view of why save languages, because it's not just words, it's culture, it's tradition, there's information in it and so on. But maybe, you know, a little bit of a large pinch of salt here, maybe, because I think the romantic view sometimes does not take into account the people concerned. So you have a lot of language warriors, including linguists and so on, who go in and, you know, this is a language to be saved. But, and we often forget the people at the center of it and what they want the language for. Is it for literacy? Is it for tradition and culture? Is it because they want to feel or get back a part of themselves? As Joe mentioned earlier, you know, language can lead to a lot of sometimes underlying conflict that may not come outright in a full-scale war, but you have a lot of keyboard warriors now as well. So you do see that conflict coming out, and in a multilingual context especially. And so this is my big but. You know, the romantic idea of saving languages and revitalizing them has to be taken into a larger context of the language ecology of the country. So countries like Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, even Thailand to a certain extent. And we're talking about a multilingual situation, and where there will be competition. Again, Joe mentioned, you know, the different at the end, towards the end, about having to find some kind of cohesion or some kind. How do you put everything together when you have your national language for international communication, and so on. So in a country like Malaysia, we have a national language. We have then English coming in very strong, still a lot of hang-ups, and still a very much a gatekeeping tool. Kristof has done some work on our policy regarding English, so he knows very well the conflicts that are within this whole policy of having English in our education system, and also for employability. And then Mandarin is also very, very strong in Malaysia because of our large Chinese population. But if you look at our language vitality, you can see that almost 90% or more of our languages are actually considered to be endangered, meaning that they have very few fluent speakers left. They are not being passed on to the next generation. And most of these languages are indigenous languages. Surya has been doing some work or did a PhD on looking at education in among Orang Asli community. But this is a really big problem, because our Orang Asli groups or our indigenous groups in Peninsular Malaysia are divided into so many subgroups, and some groups have like less than 100 people left, not just speakers, but 100 people, less than 100 people left. So you can imagine that there's a lot of conflict, a lot of confusion even within this whole language ecology, before we can even talk about the romanticized notion of language revitalization. And we haven't even gone into like using a home language or the students' native language for literacy purposes or for education. So the current context in most cases in Malaysia, and I think it applies to most countries, when we talk about languages in danger, there are generally fewer younger speakers. So in most cases, in some of the Orang Asli groups that we've been to, the smaller groups like Kenstu in the north of Peninsular Malaysia, you've got about 200 people, and out of which it's mainly the ones over 60 that can still speak it. And the level of fluency as well is quite, it would be very different among the oldest speakers. So this is the situation you're going to find even with languages like Malacca Portuguese. So new languages become the home language, be it a variety of English, a Malay dialect, Mandarin for Chinese speakers as well, and you have fewer contexts of use. So if that language was used among family members, in cultural activities, for religious or spiritual practices, that those even as a lingua franca in a small village or a small town. So over time, there are less opportunities to use the language. So and it comes down to just in the home, and if they still live together, the community still live together, there might be opportunities to use it within the community. But you will find that as younger people leave their villages because sometimes there are no schools nearby, or they have to go get a job in the city. So you'll find that only the old people are living in the villages, and the young parents also move along with their young children. So what happens is there's less use even within the family, less passing on of the language from one generation to another, less passing on of culture practices as well. Yeah. So what about changing attitudes then? There are both ways to look at it. There are people who feel I have to switch to a majority language or a main language, whether it's Malay and also English or Mandarin. But on the other hand, we're also finding with some communities, there's almost a resurgence, like, why are we losing our home language? Let's do something to bring it back into preschool, to use it within the family, and also to create context where our language can be used again. So there are changing attitudes as well, and fighting against the kind of mainstream policies, that may exist in the country. Okay, so the attitude part is actually very important because, and Austin and Salabang mentioned this as well, that if you want to look at the survival of an endangered language as to the why this language and can actually go on, it's actually a lot of it goes back to the attitudes towards the language as well. And we know that this is not an easy thing to say, it's my home language, therefore I love this language. Then at the same time, I'm not really passing it on to the next generation. I'm not using it to speak to my children. So it's again, conflicts. There's conflicts at different levels, and in terms of attitudes also. There may be conflict, conflict within the community, and communities within communities, and so on. Yeah. And related to these are changing ideologies. I'm just checking on my time. Okay. Changing ideologies of whether some languages are more important than others. If we go back to language policies, in the way that they make statements, are always going to say that some languages are more important than others, even if they don't outrightly say this, right? The way that language policies are shaped. If you take Malaysia as an example, although Malay is our national language, a lot more people know about the English language roadmap than they probably do about the Malay language roadmap. And we have to ask ourselves why this is so, right? And why is it that many parents are clamoring, non-Chinese parents even, are clamoring and fighting to put their kids into Chinese medium primary schools? Is it just because they learn math better, or that's just the stereotypical view, right? Or is it because they want their children to be able to speak Mandarin, even if they are non-Chinese? Yeah, and then this whole English-centric notion or policies which prevail in many countries, and one of the reasons, if we really look at who are the people that are really shaping policies in a country, even if they are local people, which socioeconomic groups do they tend to come from? And what is their reality really? This could give us some answers as to why the policies are made in such a way. Even if they say they engage stakeholders, who really are the stakeholders that they have engaged? If you dig deeply into the actual stakeholders versus the end users, you may find that there is, again, conflict at this level. Yeah. And of course, in a country like Malaysia, also most countries which are multilingual, you have this. It happens in Australia too, right? This whole thing about if you don't speak English, are you not Australian? So the national identity versus in countries like Malaysia, your ethnic identity, and then your cultural identity, your religious identity, everything, even your geographical identity, right? You speak a certain dialect of Malay, and that identifies you as someone who belongs to a particular geographical area. So again, this whole, when you have so many languages competing with each other, and it is related to people's identity, we have to acknowledge the fact that we can have several identities, and it doesn't mean that just because I speak I speak English, and if I am a dominant English speaker, it doesn't mean that I don't identify myself as Malaysian. When I speak, I can speak English and still identify my Malaysianness via the way that I speak English. I think, Ruanni, you can understand what I'm trying to say here. Yeah, but people somehow still, the policymakers still seem to have this view that no, you have to only speak English in a particular way and that, or there's the other side where, the nationalists might say, oh, if you have to get rid of English, you have to focus on Malay, for example, because then you're losing your national identity. So I would argue that you can still have your national identity by using your variety of Malay or English or Chinese or Mandarin. Yeah. So that is something that a lot of policymakers don't acknowledge. Okay, so if in terms of researchers, language researchers, linguists, language educators, so researchers do a whole bunch of things. They take tremendous effort to document, to describe the language, to publish. But what are the expectations? And this is something I brought up earlier. What are really the expectations of the users, of the stakeholders involved in language education, literacy, and also among the community, right? What are their priorities really? Is it putting food on the table versus, wanting to use, say, Kristang or Malacca Portuguese back into religious ceremonies, for example? What are their expectations? And often there is tension there and there is a mismatch. Often there is no connection between the researchers, language educators, and the language communities and the end users. Yeah. So this brings me to some of the enabling factors that we might want to consider, which is working together with communities from the onset, even when we're doing linguistic documentation and research, and getting ideas from the communities themselves, who are really the experts of the language and the culture, but creating networks with a whole bunch of other people, be they business people or people who funders, medical people, whoever. Some of the indigenous people that we do language research on said, you guys come in one at a time. Why can't you just come in as a whole, and then we can talk about all the different issues that we have? So don't just try to save our language, but help us in other ways, in using language to talk about medical literacy even, or health. Okay, of course we need money funding as well. Okay, so I've got like about 2 minutes. If you can give me that, Kristof, to just very quickly share some of the work with Portuguese Malacca, also known as Papaya Kristang, commonly known as Papaya Kristang or just Kristang, and some of the things that we've been doing, which started from language research on the sounds and the sociolinguistic phenomena, particularly on efforts to what efforts to revitalize were there before, and then moving on to actually coming up with materials. We talked about activities earlier, right? So first we started with materials and what the community members wanted. We started with a CD of Catholic prayers, because the Kristang people are mainly Catholic, and many people forgot how to pray in Kristang, and they felt they wanted to remember how to pray in Kristang again. And then we also then came up with a book to learn Kristang, which is used to teach Kristang. So I'll just go and show you. Yeah, so this was the book that we worked together with the community. So in the village, children learn now online, it's been online for the last 2 years. I think they will go back to in-person learning now. So at least there's a resource, because this is not something that is taught in school. Yeah. Okay, I know I've passed my 15 minutes, but just another couple of minutes just to share with you. Let me just stop my timer. Okay, so so this literacy efforts, or the efforts to learn Kristang, happens in the village by someone from the village, someone called Sarah Santa Maria. And these are some in the book. We really tried to use things from the culture itself. So the like songs, stories, and so on. We also have an app, which is still work in progress, really, which is like a dictionary, English Kristang dictionary, because most Kristang speakers, not just in Malacca, but all over the Malacca Portuguese diaspora, Singapore, Australia, Canada, the UK, are mainly English speakers. So that's their main resource. So this is the other thing about using other resources to then to learn or to revitalize the home language or the heritage language, yeah, because multilinguals have other resources, linguistic resources at their in their language repertoire, if you like. Then we tackled the children. So we worked with the children. So the children illustrated this folk song, and we did it in 3 languages: Malay, Kristang, and English. Because again, the children know English and Malay, and so they could actually make out what the words were in Kristang by using their resources for English and Malay. So we did this, Nina Boboy. And so in terms of activities during the Free Linguistic Conference, we actually went to Malacca on this thing called Language Travels. This was mooted by Amar Mahbub, who's from Sydney University. And we went to Malacca, and we actually, it was the children who did most of the hard work, actually, which was quite surprising, but they loved it. And it was an opportunity for them to use the language and to teach other people the language. So, and it has some economic benefit as well, because people can pay for these trips, and instead of paying a third party agent, this is all done within the community. And we have taken this a few steps further. We've had bringing guests from Malaysia who don't know about the language, don't know about the culture, working with the community to do food, to do tours around the village, and just getting the community involved in using their language. So this is another activity that we did to help revitalize, to keep the language going. Yeah. So some considerations is to actually, there has to be solidarity. This is not an easy thing to do within every community, every village. There will be conflict again. So finding that ground within the community, and then within the outside people, like the researchers, the funders, and the community also is not an easy thing. It takes a lot of time, and you have to be prepared for a lot of brickbats thrown at you. And then that sense of ownership, we talked about attitudes earlier. The projects that we've done with the Malacca Portuguese community would not have been possible without the community members or the representatives taking ownership and committing to the activities, committing to sitting down and working on the language and trying to break it down, trying to figure out how to spell it, how to pronounce it, and so on. Yeah. And this gives this gives a sense of empowerment to the community, who then don't feel that the language researchers, the academics, the researchers are telling them what to do, how to pronounce, how to spell, and so on. But it's a negotiation in a sense. Yeah. And I think use of multilingual resources is a big thing. You have to, if you don't use English and you don't use Malay, it's very hard for the children, very hard for the adults especially those who've forgotten or who really don't use Kristang on a daily basis, to follow what's going on in the classes or in the books. Yeah. So again, talking about this earlier, I said about this conflict. So we have to manage expectations. Yeah. Definitely have to manage expectations, and to create an impact. We do have to think about language learning and use, because a lot of the young parents don't speak the language fluently enough to pass it on to their children. So how do we make use of the older generation before they pass on to not just create materials, but to create opportunities for them to be able to talk with the children? So having that language travels earlier, the microtourism was a good way to involve the older generation and the young children together, so that they can use and practice the language and learn new words and so on. Yeah. And input from other disciplines, from education, from economics, is actually, we are finding that, we have to go in as a team. The linguistic researchers cannot be on their own always, and reaching out to communities. So with indigenous communities as well is reaching out to communities, working with communities. During the coronavirus, for example, it became very apparent that how do you communicate very quickly important information about at first it was about safety, and second was about vaccination. How do you communicate with in languages that are not usually that are more verbal than written? So coming up with videos and so on, using the community to come up with these videos and whatever not, say audio materials as well. You can't just use posters, and if you just use the national language, it may not get across. It's maybe too official and scary sounding. Yes, it was a scary time, but how do we then reach out to communities? Became very apparent that, hey, we have so many languages now. How do we deal with this? Yeah, and advocacy as well. So if we don't advocate and we don't keep talking about the fact that we are multilingual, you need to acknowledge the fact that there are children who speak a different language at home, and then you throw them sometimes totally away from even from their family because there's no school nearby. And then you throw them in the situation where they have to now exist in this new language. It's really scary, and it's very easy to just shut down. And that is probably one of the causes also of dropouts, attrition, and and the literacy rates going down. Okay, so I am done, as I want to show you. It is a complicated, non-romanticized situation when you talk about language revitalization. In any situation, we have to take into account that language doesn't exist in a vacuum. So you have to think about how it's related to other things, whether it's economics or education, media, crisis communication, IT, so on and so on. So this is a big picture that it's complicated. It goes on and on, this network. Okay. So with that, muito grande merci. I want to thank everybody from the community that's been involved in all my projects. And also, I did not talk about the work with indigenous communities here, but also thank everybody else who's been involved. So with that, I will stop now, Kristof. And sorry for going above time. Let me stop this. Okay.
Thank you very much. No worries about the time. I think we are fortunate enough to have a space which, there's no one going to kick us out of our conference room at the end of the session. So we can be a bit more relaxed. Thank you very much, Prof. Stefanie. I think that was a really good talk, really good reminder, right? When we're talking about language and we're talking about in whatever kind of context, we're talking about people, really, right? We're talking about the people who speak that language. And I think with revitalization, especially, we're looking at the impact that development has on people, right? And how we can try to sometimes reverse or sometimes, challenge that kind of impact. Yeah. Okay. And I think this leads us brilliantly to our next speaker, which is Ruanni Tupas. Ruanni is a lecturer at the Center for Applied Linguistics, which is part of the Institute of Education at University College London. And before that, he was assistant professor at the National Institute of Education, which is part of Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is, like all our speakers, also an author of many scholarly works talking about issues connected to English and multilingualism in the Philippines and Singapore, and very applicable in a very broader sense. Most notably, I think, is his focus on unequal Englishes, which there is a very well-known book edited by him on that topic, and I hope he won't mind me sharing, currently editing another book on the effects of unequal Englishes. So, and that is very much what he's I think, going to talk about. So, Ruanni, I think, is the perfect person to talk to us more about the inequalities between people that we can see in developing societies. We do want to apologize for Ruanni's laptop, which shows a very bad moment to stop working just 5 minutes before the talk was going to start. So we will. I hope that we'll understand that Ruanni is not able to show us his slides. Okay, but Ruanni, go ahead and welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Kristof. I'm glad there's an official statement on why I'm not using PowerPoint slides. I think I can get by, but I just would like to apologize. If you have to put up with me for the next few minutes, I'm talking about inequalities of multilingualism in my own context as well. But first of all, thank you very much, Kristof, again for the invitation. I've enjoyed so far very thoroughly the contributions of Joe and Stefanie, and I'm sure later as well. My presentation actually falls really very nicely immediately after Joe's and Stefanie's, precisely because I will also be talking about inequalities of multilingualism in broad terms, but at the same time, more specifically in the context of promotion of Philippine languages. All right. So it's getting, in a sense, to me, a little bit narrow in that sense, but at the same time, also later on, take it all back conceptually as well by looking at, by framing it. This is actually my title, which of course, you won't be able to see, but basically looking at inequalities of multilingualism as structures of feeling. For the past few years and very recently, I've actually been involved in several pop music fandoms in the Philippines, and I have actually written about issues of language and issues of multilingualism that have actually been published in several national newspapers that are accessible, of course, online as well. So I have engaged, in other words, on very everyday-like basis, in terms of discussions, precisely because I entered these fandoms not because I was a researcher. I was researching for something about language, but precisely because I was really interested in joining these fandoms and their conversations. And it's only as I got myself more immersed in these conversations that I realized that language is actually very much embedded in these discussions, and especially so now because I'm zeroing in on a particular Filipino multilingual group, which is called Alamat, which is actually explicitly a multilingual group that has an advocacy that advocates the promotion of Philippine languages in pop music, right? And so those, it's unfortunate that I don't have my slides, but definitely there's so much of it online as far as my other presentations are concerned. So you may be able to listen to them and watch them as well, and so on and so forth. But just a little bit of an introduction. Alamat is, as one of the, big groups in the Philippines at the moment. And it's interesting that, I'm following Stefanie's presentation precisely because I think this is one of those contemporary, very recent initiatives in, surfacing and promoting minoritized languages in different countries. And one of those, to me, effective ways of opening up conversations about inequalities of multilingualism, especially among the young at the moment, is through pop music, through pop culture, all right? But interestingly, because this is Alamat, this is a group that is actually explicitly advocating the promotion of Philippine languages. So in fact, their group members come from different parts of the Philippines, right? Representing supposedly different languages, all right? And these languages actually appear in many of their songs at the moment, right? So it's actually the first group ever that we know. Of course, there have always been songs in different Philippine languages, but not a song in many different languages in one at a time. In one particular song put together. So when you actually listen to their songs, you actually get to listen to the different sounds of the Philippine languages, right? And according to Alamat, of course, this is one way of, to them, addressing inequalities of multilingualism in the Philippines, because especially so in Philippine music, other than English and the national language, which is Tagalog, which is Filipino, all right, all the Philippine languages basically are marginalized in terms of, their centrality in music. Of course, there is Cebuano or Bisaya, there's Ilocano, there's Hiligaynon, but they are all, located in different regions. They're not mainstreamed nationally, in other words, but this is Alamat, trying its best and so on and so forth. So as a language scholar, therefore, I got myself interested in it. But fortunately, they contacted me to help them to collaborate on a particular, a few things basically. But one of those things, which then Kristof, I will be able to show later on, is they invited me specifically for one particular content, which is to help explain the difference between a language and a dialect. All right, just a language and a dialect, because in the Philippines now, centrally, all right, this is a point of conversation, because Philippine languages for a long time have been historically described and basically defined as dialects, not as Philippine languages, and even in the textbooks, it is Philippine languages as dialects, all right? And Alamat was wanting to basically provide some sort of like a brief academic explanation. The request to me was, please explain the difference between language and dialect as if you're explaining it to elementary, primary students. So you can imagine how exciting on the one hand, but at the same time challenging on the one hand. Now, I was, however, therefore, interested in the responses to the Alamat songs. I was interested in the responses to our own video as well, which right now actually has more than 400,000 views on YouTube, because it has now been shared online and shared actually in classrooms in the Philippines as well. All right. So I would like to show just a snippet of a reaction to this video, because this snippet is a representation of the many feelings and emotions that emerge out of this video, but at the same time also from the music videos of Alamat. I go back to the title of my paper, which my presentation, which is on Inequalities of Multilingualism as Structures of Feeling. The idea being that seemingly mundane feelings and emotions that are generated by these songs, by the use of these languages, for example, right, are structured feelings that are, that can be explained historically, and therefore can also be actually sites of agency and sites of cultural and political transformation, something that has also been missed out in a lot of social linguistic work as well. All right. So Kristof, probably you can start. It's only for about 1 minute.
Okay, you can see it, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. At mga wika na mga tradisyon, hindi ito ganun ka-importante. At kung tawagin nating Philippine languages ay mga dialects, parang sinasabi na rin natin na hindi ganun ka-importante yung mga lingwahe natin. Kasi nga, hindi sila, local lang sila, regional lang sila. At kung kakantahin natin ito, gamitin natin ito sa mga kanta, hindi maganda ang tingin ng iba. Kasi nga, local lang yung mga languages na ito. So dapat buwagin natin yung pag-iisip na ito. We have to think na first and foremost, yung Philippine languages ay hindi dialects. They are real languages. They're full-blown languages na kailangan natin gamitin dahil kung totoong multilingual at proud tayo bilang mga Pilipino, itong mga wika natin na ito ay kasing level ng wika ng kahit kanino man sa buong mundo.
7 Up Fiber ใหม่มีใยอาหารอร่อยช่วยกระตุ้นการขับถ่าย
Okay.
Tama. Sa pamamagitan ng musika, layunin ng Alamat ang ipagliwang ating pagka-Pilipino. Wait. This video hit me differently because, na-feel ko talaga yung purpose and ng Alamat. Nahiya ako. Yung purpose ng...
Okay. Can you stop, Kristof?
Okay.
Okay, I wanted to show that it's just really a snippet, but imagine hundreds of videos like that. All right. Expressions of anger, expressions of surprise. When you look at music video, the music videos and the reactions, when someone who is, let's say, I am, for example, from the Visayan region, right? And there are quite a number of those who are Bisaya speakers, and they heard a word and the sentence in a particular song, and they get jolted. All right, there's surprise, there's expression of, I mean, you see a lot of these young Filipinos actually crying just by listening to a word or to a sentence in this particular song. All right, in one of these songs, for example. And so I was especially interested in really showing that snippet, so that there's some kind of visualization. Of course, this is someone crying, but there's also someone really excited, someone also extremely surprised. All right, hearing, oh my God, all right, what's that? Is that Ilocano? That kind. And to me, and I will be talking about this in a little while in the context of conceptualizing its structures of feeling. It's very, very very strategically important when we are talking about the impact of promoting languages, the impact of how we actually promote marginalized or minoritized languages in our specific communities as well. From the point of view of critical social linguistics, the first immediate response is these are tokenisms. All right, these are like, what does a word in Bisaya got to do, or can do, basically? What impact does it have, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the responses, and here I'm not talking about only video responses, but online, so on Twitter, all right, with the use of emojis as well, use of crying emojis and so on and so forth. But at the same time, also on Facebook, and of course also on YouTube, you see how such responses also translate to desires to learn more about these languages, desires to now start thinking about, hey, now that why are my languages not represented in Philippine music and all that and so on, and those kinds of comments. So there is that kind of a relationship between those. And so what I'd like to then therefore to talk about in a few more minutes is that when this whole idea of Philippine languages as dialects, all right, and when Alamat came to me and basically invited me to talk about this and collaborate on them with this, it is really to basically just a bit to clarify conceptually the difference between languages and dialects, all right. But then when their music videos came out, but then when this music, this video came out as well, I found a different dimension to it, and so as I said, these are spaces of effective mobilization in the promotion of languages. Now, why is this important to bring in this whole idea of structures of feeling? Because on the one hand, you see, for those of you who are probably fairly familiar with social linguistic work, all right, there are, in a sense, two sides, two ways of looking at inequalities of multilingualism. All right, you look at, for example, such inequalities as located in social structure. All right, so inequalities of multilingualism as very, very much structural in nature. So of course you have linguistic imperialism as one of those representations of such kinds of ways of looking at it. All right, definitely has much sense in talking about inequalities of multilingualism as structural in nature. So this is what you may call some kind of like a top-down approach to understanding such inequalities of multilingualism. On the other hand, all right, of the theoretical spectrum, you have bottom-up ways of looking at these inequalities of multilingualism, basically looking at them as forms of resistance, looking at them as agency, for example, right? So you have, in a sense, theoretical oppositions. On the one hand, the more structural, but at the same time, you have the more resistive, most post-colonial and post-modern approaches to inequalities of multilingualism, or understanding politics of language, for that matter. So when we're talking about agency, you're talking about resistance, you are also talking about, let's say, explicit political stances or explicit political practices, that are observable, that we do in order to resist, particular configurations of dominant languages. All right. But subjectivity as a concept doesn't seem to figure in all of this, and I'm bringing in this whole idea of structures of feeling, because you see, if we look at these emotions, if we look at these expressions of, let's say, expressions of anger on the one hand, but expressions of optimism on the other hand as well. All right. Structures of feeling help us understand how the seemingly, mundane, everyday, individualistic, feelings about language, towards language for that matter, are to a large extent also historically structured. All right. One in very simple terms, for example, one asks, why did he cry to start? Why was this young person, upon hearing a word or a sentence in this particular song of Alamat, suddenly got jolted, eyes wide, for example? Because somehow it must come from somewhere. All right. That kind of a response must have come from somewhere. And if you look at it historically, in other words, historically, you go back to, let's say, for example, the Philippine-American War, in 1899 to 1902, during which this whole idea of the Philippine languages as dialects became center to the justification as to why English should be the only medium of instruction, or why English should only be imposed as the only medium of instruction in the Philippines. There, of course, the idea of local languages as dialects is not something that's unique to the Philippines. But what I see in the Philippines is that historically this has actually gone through structural distribution or circulation, for that matter, because it is the schools that were used to to propagate these kinds of understandings of Philippine languages as dialects, such that now, even with the kinds of explanation that you provide, and you have conversations on Twitter now, it still keeps on coming back. No, Philippine languages are dialects because they are of low value, they're not valuable, and so on and so forth. They're only very local, and so on and so forth. So you see, the very structural dimension to how, or historical dimension to how, in such inequalities of multilingualism, captured, of course, in this whole phrase of Philippine languages as dialects, as something that doesn't just simply get generated, through these feelings that are, or that should be viewed as something individual or individualistic, right? So there is something, in other words, there's something social, but at the same time, also something very individual or subjectivist in the way we look at these responses to these Philippine languages. So you talk about this a network of affects and emotions, all right, which in a sense try to bring together, all right, the role of structure, all right, the role of social structure in the perpetuation, in the creation and the mobilization of these emotions and affects. But at the same time, all right, I think this is something that is important to bear in mind. But at the same time, that these, network of emotions that are very, that come through, all right, in seemingly mundane environments, all right, are also sites of transformation, can also be sites of political change and cultural change, all right. So we see the individual, in other words, as a site, a space where things can actually be transformed, all right. But the individual, not just simply an individual that is, structurally dissociated from everything else and everyone else in society, but this individual that is also somehow shaped historically. I think, to me, when I was able to look at these responses, all right, again, not just the video responses, but also the responses in the conversations online, all right, when online you have the written words as well, representing their own emotions, angry emotions and so on and so forth, right? You see the convergence, all right? And probably in a sense, I don't want to call it even convergence, but the breaking down of these boundaries between what we use as structure, but at the same time also as agency, but all here constituted by and mobilized in this seemingly mundane, but at the same time also structurally formed emotions and affects as well. So going back to my point, I think here where I'm talking about the inequalities of multilingualism, the kinds of inequalities that, that Alamat basically attempts to address, all right, because of the lack of representations of Philippine languages and cultures of the speakers of these Philippine languages in Philippine music, all right, and how indeed these can actually now showcase our understanding of, what may be a way out, of these, debate between structure and agency, to look at these emotions and feelings, in ways that, I think you can look at them as more both individual and social at the same time. In other words, I think this is one way, to enter conversations about change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruanni. I just put my hand up and you timed yourself perfectly. Thank you very much, Ruanni. That was really really interesting. Yeah, I think Ruanni just posted a couple of days ago that he was quoted in Teen Vogue. Is that right? Which I think probably you must be the first linguist to appear there. Which is, I think it's an interesting path that you're taking, right? With sort of very explicit advocacy. That is really really a very, very interesting thing to hear about. Thank you. Okay, and now this leads us to our next speaker, which is Tony Capstick. Now, Tony is currently working at the Department of Applied Linguistics and English Language, which is at the University of Reading in the UK. He is an associate professor there. And he specializes in the area of language and migration, yeah. And he has particularly worked on that in the South Asian context in Pakistan. He is the author of 2 books, one on multilingual literacies, identities and ideologies, and then a more recent one on language and migration, which I believe must be one of the first textbooks to look at that issue in particular. Yeah. We probably don't have to say why migration is relevant, as we see even in the COVID era, our mobility was, very much a defining characteristic, yeah, of where we are now. So we're very glad to have Tony to share with us. Okay, Tony, welcome, and go ahead.
Thank you, Kristof, and thank you to the previous speakers. There's so much there for us to think about. I will try and hopefully make some connections between what Joe and Ruanni and Stefanie have been talking about, even though I'm looking at very different settings in some ways. Kristof posed this title for me, Role of Language in Transnational Migration Flows, and I was determined to stick with it and work with it. But it's, of course, as all of our fields are all sort of interdisciplinary, looking at migration, looking at people on the move and the kinds of mobility that the world is experiencing at the moment, obviously makes for fascinating work. But conceptually, theoretically, methodologically, it makes for rather daunting work at times. This picture here in my first slide, you can see one of the refugee camps in Lebanon, where I've been working since 2015, 2016. And if you think about some of the things that Ruanni was just talking about, inequalities of multilingualism and transformation and change, you can imagine just from this picture, just what kinds of transformational practices occur here when people from across the region are displaced to settings such as this, you know, not knowing how long they're going to be there. So what I want to do in my 15 minutes is introduce some of the work that I've been involved in over the last few years, but focus in on this idea of flows and trying to look at maybe some of the more kind of bottom-up practices that have already been mentioned today, and see how they are trying to maybe resist some of those top-down policies, top-down structural sort of relationships that Ruanni was just talking about. So I want to kick off with a moment on Ukraine. You know, over nearly 6 million people displaced now outside of Ukraine in neighboring countries, mainly to the west of the country. Obviously, lots more internally displaced. And it's unusual to, certainly in the events that I attend, it's quite unusual to see European policy sort of lauded, but here we have this wonderful opportunity to where we see I think an unprecedented directive by the European Parliament to make this harmonized approach to Ukrainians fleeing. So 18-year-olds and under are able now to access education. So young children, teenagers, young adults are finding places in schools in those neighboring countries and trying to continue with their education. Now, I'm not working on projects involving Ukraine, but this isn't that dissimilar to some of the work that I've been involved in over the last few years, looking at Syrians who have left Syria and have arrived in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey. And so I'll be talking a little bit about that, as well as talking about my research in South Asia. And what I want to do is pin down some key terms that I see moving from across different, maybe discursive spaces. So, you know, I used to work in more kind of a development education context, where things like core skills and life skills were important parts of non-formal provision. Now, I see those kinds of pedagogical goals entering into formal education in response to the kinds of mobility that we've seen, as well as this kind of psychosocial support that many non-governmental organizations are offering. And of course, this has a huge impact on how people then continue with their education, find work, remit you know, resources back to their home countries, as well as trying to build a life for themselves in their new countries. So for me, these are quite important terms that are moving across these different spaces. Core skills, language is a central component when teachers are tasked with these kinds of pedagogical decisions. So critical thinking, problem solving. How are teachers in these very transitory settings, how are they going to develop the skills to help their learners also develop skills in these areas? Similarly, psychosocial support, trying to help people who have dealt with great adversity and trauma in their lives. How are they going to be embedded in these very, very multilingual settings? So if you consider the kinds of classrooms where in Iraq, where you have displaced people moving up from the central and southern regions of Iraq up into the Kurdistan region, where different varieties of Kurdish are used alongside Arabic and alongside English, if you're trying to get into a university, then how are these life skills, core skills, psychosocial competencies, how a teacher is expected to tackle these kinds of decisions that come from the top? So I look at this in relation to some of the work that's already been referred to today, trying to sort of destabilize some of the kind of labels and categories that we put language into. So I spent a long time working with Pakistani migrants in Pakistan and in the UK, and looking at how they access different varieties of English. Not so interested in the differences between those different varieties, but how people mobilize these different linguistic resources as part of their transnational trajectories. And I think this, for me, does speak to the work that people have mentioned today on inequalities of multilingualism, as well as this kind of, deterritorialization of the nation state. What does it mean if you are a young man who has recently migrated from Pakistan to the UK, are responsible for providing economic remittances to your family back in Pakistan, as well as social remittances that will continue those migratory chains of migration. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And so it's trying to look at these very fluid repertoires, trying to draw on work from sociolinguistics to understand the role of language in migration. I do see a role here for, teachers, educators, as well as policymakers who are interested in a kind of activism. If we're thinking of inequality and how we encourage more transformational practices, then where do we locate those inequalities in the language classroom or in language use more broadly? So I'm really interested in the kinds of styles, discourses, registers, genres that migrants and their families, refugees and their families, either are already developing or appropriating in the case of discourses, and how they deploy those specific language resources along their trajectories. So if you are not a speaker of English, but you arrive in an English-speaking context, or you wish to go into a school where English is the medium of instruction, what existing resources that you do have access to, how can those be deployed in either the learning of a whole new language variety, or in the learning of a new genre, perhaps? I do work with universities in Pakistan, looking at how different genres of academic writing are important to getting a successful degree or MA in a country like Pakistan, and alongside other countries. So that's, as a linguist, but also as a teacher educator, I'm really interested in helping teachers understand how we work with our learners, migrant learners predominantly, to develop some of these skills. So I move between these kind of very classroom-based research projects, and I also do quite a lot of work with organisations like the British Council, who are also very, very much involved in language policy, in materials design, in teacher education, as well as all the other things that they do. And, that's all very historically situated in terms of how organizations like that have an institutional agenda, and how we can work alongside each other to bring in new ways of working in these kind of, ELT settings, English language teaching settings. So I've done quite a bit of work with this idea of translanguaging spaces. If you have a classroom full of learners who are trying to either get back into formal education, or are trying to return home, having been displaced, how can all of the mixing that goes on in these very culturally and linguistically diverse settings, how can teachers help learners to build on these resources? And so what we found in working with refugee teachers and learners in Iraq, for example, is that, they're up against these very dominant discourses around English only, around not mixing, very, very sort of, as we know, really strong ideologies related to what it means to use different languages and what that means for different identities. And so what we wanted to look at is, in these spaces, what kinds of learning occurred. And we see very, often unplanned, teachers would never acknowledge, or very rarely acknowledge, planned translanguaging pedagogy, but they would certainly, in very unplanned moments, use a lot of Arabic, Kurdish, and English when introducing the new target language. And so we're working with a number of NGOs to see how we can harness that particular mixing and develop more materials to help teachers use these in a more planned way. And now that doesn't take away anything from the role of Arabic as well as Kurdish varieties in mainstream education, but it does try to acknowledge that when you have very, very mixed classrooms with millions of people on the move, there has to be some provision in teacher education for that kind of mix. So alongside those very small classroom-based projects, I'm also involved in national level research, looking at how, in this case, English language is delivered in Iraq. This was a project that I worked on last year and towards the beginning of this year with Simon Borg from Leeds University in the UK. And we were looking at the role of English in social and economic development. It was our brief, alongside the role of English in non-formal education. And what we found, which won't be too surprising to the audience today, is that English is used in a very traditional sense, very teacher-fronted kinds of delivery, quite old materials being used, even though we know a lot now about multilingual pedagogy and how we can support learners in very, very low income environments. The Ministry of Education, who we were working with, has very, very, very stretched resources in terms of what it can commit to its education budget. But there are opportunities there to engage with wider networks of language professionals and look to best practice in other parts of the region and in other parts of the world. So I want to talk a little bit now, maybe just for a few minutes before I close, to think about how we take up some of the theories, concepts, issues that we've talked about today and that I've mentioned in work that we do with our students. So many of us will be trying to help learners and others, perhaps sometimes, you know, the policymakers that we work with or the materials designers that we work alongside, helping them to understand what it means to draw on all of these different fields when getting a better understanding of the role of language in these transnational flows. So what I've provided here is one snapshot of a chapter from the book that Kristof mentioned earlier, to try to show the kind of coherence in the way that the pedagogy that's been built around these and how we sort of tackle some of these issues in very, very complex migratory settings. So work on language policy, work on social remittances, Peggy Levitt's work, trying to look at migration, not just from an economic perspective in terms of the financial resources that are remitted back to the country of origin, but also looking at the ideas, behaviors, skills, values that transnational family members remit. And I think this has been a very useful way into understanding the sort of social and cultural transformations that occur when people migrate, alongside the economic transformations that it can also can bring benefits to families. Looking at the role of brokering and the kinds of language mediation that go on in some of these very transnational settings. I think other presenters today have mentioned health. How do transnational families, perhaps parents in transnational families who don't have access to dominant languages such as English early on in their migrations, how do they encounter the kinds of bureaucratic practices? How do they engage with the kinds of bureaucracies around health, around social benefits, etc.? So bringing in work there from sociology and anthropology and trying to understand multilingual literacies from that perspective. Obviously, work from world Englishes, the kinds of different varieties of English that are used around the world, and how those polyglot repertoires are kind of deployed in these very migratory settings. I don't think too much has been mentioned today about online work. Maybe we have had a focus on social economic development and tried to think of it in terms of material benefits for individual families as well as societies. But clearly there's a role here for understanding how networks are also developed online, and how transnational families continue to encourage other members of those families to migrate. And clearly there's a really key role here for understanding multilingualism in these, I think Andrew Tsopoulos calls it the network society or network multilingualism. What is the role for these different language varieties which offline may not have status or prestige in certain settings? But what I've seen from work that I've been carrying out with transnational families from Pakistan is that for varieties such as Punjabi, which is not a written language in Pakistan, but is very much a written language online, where a Romanized script has been taken up, the affordances of the QWERTY keyboard have been taken up, and now we see Punjabi, Urdu and English mixed. Now, for those members of the family that are able to do that, they're then able to develop relationships across these transnational networks that become really significant for finding work, getting into different kinds of, one participant in my PhD work was able to develop a whole range of relationships with his new family members in the UK prior to leaving Pakistan. And he did that through all of this fascinating translanguaging, mixing, and being able to deploy all of the languages in his repertoire. So again, we need to draw from a range of different fields in order to understand how we pin down the development opportunities in some of this work. But I think it's a useful way of looking at how and where language might fit in. So I'll just finish with I think it was Stefanie who also finished with projects that she'd been working on, which were fascinating. This is a much smaller project, but I mean, I hope what it does is illustrate some of the work that I've been doing with universities in Pakistan and in Iraq, where we encourage learners in those settings to look at their own communities and to see how the role of the different varieties are changing constantly, particularly in communities where there is a significant number of migrants and refugees. And so it's by looking at the role of not just the dominant varieties, but also looking at the role of some of those other varieties alongside the different genres that they write in, that the learners in these projects have been able to identify how proficiency isn't always the goal. So we've looked specifically at issues around if we're going to offer scholarships to refugees coming to the UK, for example, what kinds of work, what kinds of academic English support do they need to be able to take up a place at university, which is quite clearly going to change their lives and change their families' lives. So what kinds of genres are examined, and what kinds of work as language educators do we need to do in order to help those learners become better able to master some of those genres. So I will stop there. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening to my talk.
Thank you very much, Tony. Yeah, and I think that's a great sort of segue into what I'm going to talk about at the end as well, which is the question of planning language. So let me also share my screen. What I'm going to be talking about toward the end, yeah, is I think following on really well here, which is the question of like, what do we then do with language education and how do we plan it? And especially looking at the phenomenon that's come up quite recently and that I think is having a really huge impact in what we call developing contexts, which are global language policies, okay? So just to sort of introduce what these are. So if we think about what is a language policy, right? It's some kind of measure created by some authority that tries to create usually some kind of language hierarchy, right? So it tries to place some languages in a maybe more prestigious position than others, yeah? Very often the national language, yeah, or the international language, one of them sort of being privileged, yeah? And we've seen, I think, today quite a few people talking about how this happens often in the name of nation building, right? How you know, certain minority languages get sort of pushed to the sidelines, as Prof. Stefanie and Ruanni have mentioned, whereas the sort of national language is sort of promoted to a position of visibility and prominence. Now, of course, this very often happens. This is done by the state very often, right? So by nation state, by Thailand or by Malaysia or by the Philippines, yeah. But what we've seen in sort of the last couple of decades through globalization, right, through more and more social, political, and economic integration, that the authority of the nation state is really no longer absolute, right? Each of us as an individual, but also our societies, are not just subject to what our kind of country decides. We're also subject to sort of broader authority, some authority that comes from above the state. So if you think about, for example, even governments today, they are bound to follow certain influences from above, from outside. You know, powerful nations for quite a long time have been dictating certain kinds of policy to sort of, you know, to the developing world in particular, right? Similarly, also transnational organizations, you know, talking about the United Nations, but talking also about more economically focused organizations like the OECD, right? They tend to dictate certain kind of activities, the World Bank, for example, these kind of ones, yeah? Also non-governmental organizations, and also to a certain extent, global businesses are often in this position of dictating policy, yeah? Now, I'm going to talk about a couple of just a pair of policies of this type that I've researched recently. Okay, so the first one is something that if you are sort of from an Asian context is likely to be a buzzword where you are, or if it's not yet, it will soon be a buzzword, which is CFR, yeah, or the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So this is a document that originated in Europe, originated at the Council of Europe, which is a sort of international organization, non-governmental organization based in Europe, but it has since then very much become a global frame of reference in language education. Partly because it's very popular among governments, but in particular, I think because it's very popular among people who conduct large-scale global testing of English proficiency and people who develop textbooks, yeah? Like, for example, Cambridge, the British Council, all of these are very, very big promoters of CFR. If you don't know what CFR is, the sort of most notable thing about it are these things that you can see on the screen now. So CFR will present you a bunch of scales like this arranged into these 6 levels, right? Ranging from A1 to C2. And each of these is supposed to describe a certain sort of scope of language ability, right? Sort of starting at a kind of quite basic level, right? And then continuing on to, at C2, someone who is really highly literate, we can say, in academic language. Now, CFR, I said, originated in Europe, but it has very much spread throughout the world. Recently, for example, it's been picked up in Asia by China, which has used it, which has adapted it for its own uses. It's been adapted also in Japan. It's also been used in Taiwan, Vietnam, and importantly also in Thailand and in Malaysia. Why I think this is a very interesting document to talk about in the context of this symposium is because it's very often seen as a kind of measurement, kind of measure of development. Yeah. So I'll just give you a quote here from a policy that was adopted by the Malaysian government in 2015. This is a sort of agenda document for English language education. And here, what you can see is how the CFR levels, you see here B1 and B2 being referenced, right, are basically being kind of used to compare how developed Malaysia is, right? Where does it place in this kind of global competition to move up? So we see, okay, Malaysia is ahead of Thailand, Myanmar, Indonesia, and India because it has more B1, but it's behind a country like Brazil. However, European countries typically set B2, yeah? So here is very much, you know, Ruanni was talking about the role of emotions, yeah? I think here is very much sort of tugging on the emotions of the reader of, okay, Europe, developed context, B2, therefore, we want B2, yeah? And you can see here that the document actually does continue to say, right, we must move up a level if we are to take our place among the advanced nations of the world, right? So somehow it's basically saying, okay, Malaysia is not where Europe is in terms of English proficiency, right? Therefore, we've got to work harder. We've got to get up there in order to compete with these sort of European nations at B2, yeah? Now, just for a little bit of context, okay, B2 is, if you look at what the CFR actually says at that level, B2 is the sort of minimum level that you need if you want to study at, I would say, undergraduate level with that language as the language of instruction, yeah? So if you want to study in English for your bachelor's degree, B2 is kind of what you need to do that, yeah? That is kind of the lowest level. So this is actually quite a lofty idea, right? This is quite, these are quite advanced abilities to use language, yeah? So that's definitely sort of being quite aspirational to some extent, right? In the Thai documents that I analyzed, there was another kind of similar thing. So one of the Thai documents, the Thailand Education Plan, included a table, this one is translated, okay, included a table like this, which set sort of the indicators for how the education system is going to improve over the next 2 decades, yeah, so this was 2017 to 2036. And you can see here that they've juxtaposed CFR and the targets, right? So at present, it's, you know, quite basic proficiency, right? And they basically sort of anticipated this progression where eventually for undergraduates, for people who graduate from their bachelor's degree, right? In 20 years, Thailand would consider it a success if they reach C1, yeah? That is very advanced proficiency, okay? The interesting thing that you can see here is juxtaposed with another very widely cited sort of measure of development in this kind of context, which is the PISA, okay? So this is a sort of international comparison of 15-year-old students in reading, mathematics, and science. It's administered on a sort of a couple of year cycle, and it's very much cited in education as a kind of measure of, is your education system successful or not? Yeah. And you can see here, right? So they're basically saying, okay, we're going to move up in PISA, right? The score is going to increase sort of slowly, right? Well, there's a big jump at the beginning, but then it would slowly increase, right? And similarly to that, the level of English proficiency would also increase, right? So you can very much see here, right, how this global language policy, the CFR, is being seen as something that really indicates, where does society have to go in these two nations, yeah? Let me give you another example of a slightly different example of a global language policy, okay? This is something called the EF English Proficiency Index, okay? EF, if you don't know, is education first. It is basically a global language school, like a corporation that organizes, it's an educational business, yeah? Let's just say it like that, yeah? That organizes various kinds of language education, right? And it also has its own standardized test, which you can see advertised here. It's the FSET, yeah, EFSET, yeah? And on the basis of these scores, for no apparent reason, this EF publishes a yearly report, this English Proficiency Index, which basically does what you can see here on the screen. It ranks the countries of the world according to their proficiency in English, yeah? So it categorizes, right? And you can see you get a lot of maps here, yeah? Talking about, which countries are low proficiency and very low proficiency, right? You can see a lot of those seem to be located in Asia, yeah, in our part of the world. That is kind of, now why does this business do this? Well, I'll let you think about that for a second, yeah, but I think it has a very, very clear sort of rationale for doing this. What it also does in this document, I think, is very interesting. It makes a lot of claims to notions connected to development. So after it presents all of these maps, yeah, it then gives a kind of commentary of sort of, different things that English, they say, is connected to, yeah. And basically what they do is they take their scores and then they compare those to various other kind of measurements of development that there are. So here, for example, you see that they've taken something called global freedom scores, yeah, from Freedom House, which is a kind of another sort of NGO, I believe. And they basically calculated the correlation, right, between English and freedom, right? And they've come up with this idea, okay, so English proficiency, high English proficiency nations tend to be more free, yeah? And of course, this leads into a very sort of nice, but very problematic sort of cause-effect rhetoric, where they say, if you can see this text on the left for just a few seconds, yeah, they're talking about how, because, people who can speak English are exposed to so much more information, right? Then it's natural that that they, that those societies become more free, right? So there's a kind of cause-effect assumption underlying there that, we can certainly discuss, yeah. Now, of course, being a business, right? What is their objective in publishing this document, yeah? Primarily, their objective is to motivate learning of English around the world, right? Assuming that some of that would go into their pockets, yeah? I mean, that is, if we want to put it pretty clearly, I think we can say that basically this document is like a big advertisement to some extent, yeah? Interesting, though, how it was perceived. So one of the things that I researched just very recently is how is this received in the media? And this is something that in the Thai media gets quite a lot of traction, yeah? So there's quite a lot of articles every year when this document is published, quite a lot of articles in the Thai media talking about this and talking about the fact that Thailand tends to end up quite low in this ranking, right? So here you can see this sort of disappointed Thailand ranks fifth out of six surveyed countries, only above Cambodia. Yeah. Now here, of course, this brings in again a little bit more emotion, right? Idea of probably, a very common idea among Thais, I would think, yeah, that you are more developed as a nation than Cambodia, right? So this is again bringing in some kind of emotion. Okay. Again, this one, Thai's English skills poor, ranked 53rd from 80 countries. Yeah. And there was a lot of this kind of coverage, very kind of disappointment, a kind of shame. Yeah. There was one article talking about, our prime minister, which was at the time Yingluck Shinawat. She has terrible English. Yeah. She represents us internationally, and it's such a shame, right? That is kind of a very common sort of discourse that this English proficiency index evoke in Thai mass media. Now, of course, why does this matter? Yeah, it matters because it contributes to the pressure that is raised in the end on politicians. Yeah, for more English. Yeah, for reform of English, for more hours at school, for more of everything. Yeah, something that has been going on quite a long time in Thailand, right? This sort of pressure of we must reform, we don't learn enough English, right? And this kind of media discourse really contributes to that kind of crisis mindset. Yeah, and this is very similar to also many other documents of this kind. Yeah, that they end up basically raising kind of pressure on politicians through the media. Yeah, and kind of drive policy forward. In this case, of course, driving the idea that we need to have more English, right? So if we think about, well, how do global language policy operates? Well, CFR and this EPI are quite different. Yeah, CFR is this very much government document, right? Developed by an NGO, yeah, promoted very much by governments. This English Proficiency Index is very much a kind of media document, yeah? But they do seem to operate in a similar way, or rather they seem to evoke a similar kind of dynamic, right? We get this kind of expectation of, what is development, yeah? Usually development is English in this kind of discourse, right? We then get this kind of, some kind of measurement, right? From outside to see, how our nation's performing, yeah? And when the performance is not as desired, right, we get a crisis mindset. Yeah, we get a kind of crisis of, oh my God, we need to do reform, we need to change everything. Yeah, there is actually a term for this, and the term is audit culture. Yeah, and this is something that for all of us working at universities is really part of our everyday life. Yeah, our everyday life at universities nowadays is we are being audited nonstop, right? There is always someone coming from outside to measure us from supposedly neutral perspective, right? Through things like quality assurance, rankings, performance assessment, benchmarking, testing, site visit, all of these things, right? They are a kind of measurement, they are a kind of audit, yeah, of our success, yeah? And this is very much a similar kind of thing at the level of language policy, right? That nations are being kind of measured from outside, right? This is what we want for development. Oh, you haven't achieved it, so you are underperforming. Yeah, you need to do more. And of course, just like with university rankings, there is then always a very kind of quick solution, right? How do you do more? Very often they would argue, well, you have to adopt, CFR, you need to do communicative language teaching, right? You need to hire us as an external consultant to help you carry out this reform, yeah? That is very often the dynamic. It's something that very often happens, yeah? Now, what are the effects of this? If you think about what kind of, if we go back to emotions that Ruanni mentioned, right? What is the effect of this? It's setting up a kind of emotional sort of structure around English, yeah? Making learning and speaking English as a kind of moral imperative, yeah? That we all feel in a society, right, that to be a good citizen of Thailand or Malaysia or any country, right, we need to be able to speak English. Yeah, that is a kind of a definition of what it means to be a good Filipino or a good Thai. Yeah. Now, of course, if you're in a society, and this is going back to what Ruanni mentioned, and also Joe and Prof. Stefanie, yeah. If you're in a society where not everyone has the same opportunity to learn English, yeah, that kind of moral imperative would very quickly lead to a deepening inequality, yeah. And I think here, being in the Thai context, this I can definitely see happening here, that we have a kind of stigma of not speaking English for lower income people, for people who maybe cannot access the same kind of quality education, for people who don't have the ability to travel, right, who don't live in the big cities that are kind of the most English speaking. Yeah, that is a very kind of, that happened very easily. I think that we sort of stigmatize those people. And of course, as we are doing this, right, we are also stigmatizing many kinds of Englishes, right? In the end, this kind of global language policy tends also to couple itself to the idea of one English, right? As defined by native speakers, as defined kind of as a standard language, as measured by tests, yeah? By global proficiency tests especially, right? English is good if it means that you get this score in IELTS or that score in TOEIC, yeah? Little attention there to things like local Englishes, yeah, in sort of all these places, to the features and to the kinds of English that are spoken in these contexts, yeah, that are important here, yeah, but they don't happen to be covered by those tests. Okay, so that is kind of I think perpetuating very similar trends that we've seen. Okay. On that note, I'm going to also stop myself because I've also gone over my time. Yeah. And I will see if we've got any questions. And I think we do have already a question from the very beginning. I think we go in chronological order for Prof. Stefanie. Yeah. We've got a question from Valentin in the chat. Yeah, Valentin is asking about do you think that code mixing and translanguaging, yeah, are useful for the kind of language maintenance and revitalization that you were talking about? Now, before I let you answer, yeah, while Prof. Stefanie is saying, yeah, let me just say that if you do want to contribute in some way, yeah, you can raise your hand, okay? And we'll try to find time for everyone that wants to say something, okay? Yeah, Prof. Stefanie, go ahead.
Thank you, Kristof and Valentin. I'm just reading through the question. I think that at least in the Malaysian context, most of us speak at least two languages, and when we use when we use language colloquially, especially, we do code mix, code switch a lot, and that becomes almost like a variety of its own. I don't think that it's necessarily linked to how we can maintain or revitalize the language, yeah, because this becomes a system by itself. So if I speak to a fellow Malaysian in English, you'll be wondering whether it's English or Malay or what am I speaking. But that's almost like a system by itself. It's people who are fluent in both languages do it, and it's especially so in when we speak a variety of English. So I don't think that, for example, if we look at Kristang as well, there is considerable code mixing there with Malay and English especially, but that's because most people, especially the younger generation, are more proficient and more dominant English speakers. So I think it's a whole different ballgame. Probably Ruanni has experience of this as well and can add to this. Thanks.
Yeah, Sir Ruanni, if you want to pick it up, is something that we've talked about in the past, I think, yeah, whether you know, the traditional language borders starts to make a lot more sense when we're talking about revitalization, right? Is that a context where we shouldn't be breaking the borders down? What do you think about that, Ruanni?
Well, of course, it's always a complex question, especially if it's seen through the lens of education. But if you look at it through the lens, for example, of basically communicability, you know, being able to communicate, being able to, basically facilitate dialogues, I don't see anything wrong with it. In fact, it's something central to how we communicate, which is to draw on a respective communicative repertoires.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, Joe, do you want to just tag on to that, and then I'll go to Patrick. Yeah, I see you.
Yeah, I agree with what both Ruanni and Stefanie have said. I would just add that there are contexts in which an endangered language is struggling for any kind of space, and the code switching, and especially modern promotion of translanguaging, which is very popular in all the literature, actually really squeezes the space that a small language needs. And one of the things that education programs, I don't think education is the only way to do language revitalization, but in many revitalization processes, the people involved in it are very conscious of the limited opportunities that speakers have for focused long-term attention to a particular language, and translanguaging violates that. I think it's important that we acknowledge that there are limits to how far we would promote translanguage. There are contexts, and I agree with Ruanni's point about communicability. That is definitely the case, but that's actually a problem when you talk about the particular need to create domains in which a small language can expand, in which it can extend its own vocabulary, in which, if you look at the way Catalan was expanded from the domestic domains into other domains, they did this via very active monolingualism in Catalan in environments in which Spanish had historically dominated. So I think I would just pose that as a possible limit to translanguaging.
Absolutely, yeah, and that is a very complex question, yeah, whether, in what context do boundaries actually make sense, yeah, and how do they play out? That is definitely needs more discussion, I think. Okay, Patrick, tell us, please share what you would like to share.
Yeah, once again, thanks all the speakers for the wonderful, intellectually stimulating session. I just want to mention, just want to weigh in on what Professor Pillai mentioned about the efforts to maintain and revitalize languages. I mean, the topic and the issue about language loss and language fluency really struck a deep chord on me, because if you look at the situation in Singapore, where the Singapore government consistently enshrine the use of English language in the schools and in the community, it is really sad to see that young people are no longer interested to learn the mother tongue language, the mother tongue languages and the dialects. And I honestly feel that sometimes I wonder whether it is all right for us to continue in this way, because sometimes we put too much emphasis in the learning of in the use of English language. I mean, if you talk about the situation in Japan, where the government continues to safeguard the importance of the mother tongue language, and I really salute the government efforts to do it, because they realize that it is important to stop the spread of English in the local community. And I also want to say that commend the efforts of Professor Suilai and her team for her efforts to maintain the minority languages in Thailand. I hope that we can teach our students to think more about and consider seriously whether it is worth the efforts to really go all out, to really master the English language in the name of modernization and economic development. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Prof. Stefanie, you want to pick up on that?
I knew you were going to ask me. I think the situation with English, it's a double-edged sword, right? With countries like Malaysia, Singapore, probably Philippines as well. Whether we like it or not, it has this hold on us, and it's had this hold on us. And if we ignore it completely, it's actually going to disempower a lot of our children, and most of these children or students or graduates, young adults, will be those from the more marginalized communities, so lower socioeconomic backgrounds, especially in Malaysia. And unfortunately, I would say unfortunately, our whole education system now has split into public and private. And private is generally basically English medium. And people who can afford private education, I'm talking about schools, and then of course universities, would be those from higher socioeconomic groups who probably already speak English as one of their dominant languages or dominant language. So we're already having this kind of, the balance is not there anymore. So we started with having, similar education for all, same medium of instruction, and then we said we'd provide for other languages, but somewhere along the way we got completely lost, even with our national language, and English just keeps coming back and rearing its, I don't want to say ugly head, but it keeps biting us in a very funny way, because as Kristof mentioned, the SAFER policy, the policies keep changing, flip-flopping. So, and that's always as usual at the expense of all the other local languages. And I think the space for all these languages, you cannot equate them, like they're not used in the same domains or the same context, right? But to kind of say you cannot use it in, like, for example, if you go to Chinese school, then it's completely Mandarin. You're not allowed to use your Cantonese or Hokkien or Fujian. So that kind of thing is still there, right? So it's already saying that your language is not good enough to be used in education, only certain languages. And I think the same thing, unfortunately, is still happening with English. What Kristof presented, there are still groups calling for English language, English medium schools again, so we keep going back and forth with this same argument. So yes, as whether we like it or not, English has this funny hold on us, and I'm not sure if I know how to solve this problem. Okay, I don't know whether I answered your question, not question, but addressed your comment.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point here. Yeah, I mean, coming from a European perspective, where in our kind of small European nations, there is always a very critical distance toward English, right? There is very kind of huge battles. Can we offer one subject of this bachelor in English? No, it has to be in the national language in parallel with the English option, right? For me, it was quite shocking here to find, for example, just since Patrick mentioned the minority region in the deep south of Thailand, having, for example, English medium programs, not even as, a very much elite education in the cities, but, in this peripheral area of the country, to have schools which offer an English medium program. That was quite surprising, Okay, James has got a question that he wants to ask. Go ahead, James. What do you want to say?
Thank you very much. I'm James from Ruanni University, right here. It's kind of a question, and at the same time, it's a compliment to what you just presented, Kristof, about the English proficiency test as a educational business. I've kind of argued about that for many years, and I think. For me, from where I'm coming from Ghana, the Republic of Ghana, and Ghana is an English-speaking country. And if I have to, submit my documents for evaluation in some countries, they require me to take an IELTS. When I went to start on the IELTS, the person who was interviewing me, I have to be honest, my English was far better than him, to be honest, and I'm not joking. And I am taking this IELTS, and I'm listening to this guy, and this guy is going to rate me You see, so and I took it in Korea when I was working in Korea. So, that particular point, I came home and I was, just philosophizing in my mind that what's the point of the IELTS? It's just that these people are trying to make money out of, us. And, I mean, it annoys me sometimes, to be honest. And like what Kristof was saying that about, all the kind of, proficiency tests that people have to take. And even here in Thailand, when some schools are looking like we want native speakers. You get an idea? And, we need teachers, not native speakers. Somebody can speak perfect English, but not a good teacher, to be honest with you. And so, like, to add to what I'm saying, so if we can work towards, finding a common ground where English is good. I have to be honest. English is good. It's a global language, whether we like it or not. Of all the countries that I've been, English has helped me. But when we go into a situation or into a particular country and we feel that their language is not important anymore, that we impose, the medium where we transmit the language to them, is like we're imposing it on them, and that will be that will be a problem. So if we can work towards that, to bring a common ground on how to educate people and how to educate them in the English language without imposing it on them, without letting them feel that their language is not important as well, which it will help. So, and I think my question to Tony. Tony, how do you scout out students coming into your program, like the master's program or the PhD program? You made mention that you scout students by picking them from you evaluate them based on their English proficiency level. For example, someone is from Iraq. This person is desperate to be a doctor. He doesn't have, the English accent, but he can speak English all right, and his scores are good. But without him getting the English proficiency test with the IELTS and other things, he can't get into your school. Don't you think that it's becoming a bridge to limit people who have the knowledge, who can do better things to help the society? What do you think? So that's my question for you. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you, James, for your question. I mean, the quick answer is absolutely. I do. They're all gatekeeping devices, and universities, particularly universities in countries like the UK, are very expensive places to study. So there's a whole range of bureaucratic barriers in place to stop people who don't have very much money from entering these spaces. They're big business, and an international student, I think it's about £18,000 now to study a master's in the UK. The closing slides for my presentation were more about trying to work with university authorities in countries, not just in Europe, but in Asia and also in sub-Saharan Africa, who are trying to break down some of these barriers and enable refugee learners in particular to take up scholarships. So there's money available by governments, by also by the EU in the European context, for a significant number of scholarships to allow those students to study. But English language becomes a barrier for them being able to not just pass the IELTS to get into the university, but to be able to cope with all of the different genres of English that are then used to deliver those master's or BA courses. So my interest as a teacher trainer is, how do we build materials? How do we design materials? How do we work with teachers? But also, how do we engage with university high-ups to allow them to understand some of the things that we've been talking about today, so that the student, so it's so complicated and there's so many barriers. But I do think we know enough now about how to design these kinds of programs that enable displaced learners to take up these opportunities. We do know enough about how to do it, but it's bringing together the different stakeholders to enable us to advocate for the kinds of changes that have been described. I don't know if that answers your question, James, because there's certainly not a simple answer to that question.
It's true, it's not simple, and well, somebody can share, but thank you very much. I really appreciate your answer.
Thank you. Yeah, James, you also reminded me, since you were talking about tests and then questioning the sort of admission. I just remembered the big issue with ETS that just where the sort of reality of just how horrible that process was to many international students, completely innocent. Yeah, which, if you don't know the background, so the Educational Testing Service was disqualified from being used for visas in the UK completely a couple of years ago, because they found some people cheating. Well, it turned out that they very poorly identified who had been cheating, and a lot of completely innocent international students basically got kicked out of the UK, and I think only managed to sort of get some sort of acknowledgement only now, I think after about 5 or 6 years since that happened. Yeah, yes, and that is absolutely a sort of yeah, an area of injustice, yeah, with testing and all of that. Absolutely, yes. Okay, anyone else who has we do have a couple of questions left in the chat. Shall we continue? Yeah, for another 5 minutes, is that okay? Yeah, okay. All right, if anyone does need to leave, yeah, please don't feel like you have to stay. Yeah? I'm not paying you, so we do have a couple of questions. I think one very nice from Rina here in the chat is asking about how can we get ASEAN citizens to cope with the effects of global policy. Is it possible for ASEAN to have their own policy, particularly for standardized or for global in face of global policies like CFR? What do we think? Is there a place for local agency? I think Joe maybe has a hand up.
Well,
yeah?
I think ASEAN has had policy. I mean, one of its very first policies was practices and policy was the creation of the Regional English Language Center, which then expanded. So it's always had a policy, and it had an informal policy of English only, and then it made it actually very explicit. I think, you know, I was really taken by James's comment, and I feel that, and the responses to it, and I feel that a very important thing that we all should learn from the discussion in general, that everyone has contributed to, and that is that language specialists like us really need to press government authorities through the media. You know, Kristof's magnificent presentation really brings that home, the way in which EPI and CEFR are taken up and naturalized within media. We have to work through the media with counter discourses. And I think one of the aims that we should have is to press governments not to have piecemeal policies. I mean, Stefanie made the point about the oscillating from this to that. This is the way it always happens. And when this happens, it's always in favor of dominant and hegemonical groups. That kind of tossing and turning and structural changes like private education are never going to work for the most disadvantaged and displaced people. So the only way to counter this is by asking governments or pushing them to develop comprehensive policies. Within the same policy that they talk about English, they should talk about revitalization of minority languages. Now, I've done this kind of work, and the first thing they tell you is, oh no, that's just pie in the sky. They reject it. So if you raise this with them, you have to expect that they won't accept it at first. But it can work. That's what we did in Australia. I'm not trying to say our model should work everywhere else, but it's happened in other places, because if you only have informal policy or non-explicit policy, it will always favor dominant groups. They have the resources to make what they want count. And if you allow chopping and changing, it will equally always disadvantage the smallest groups. The only way to protect all of smaller groups, marginalized populations, and people that are relatively neglected or oppressed in systems is by encouraging policies that look at language in general, focus on literacy and opportunity and success in education for everybody, that understand economic language. I mean, one of the problems with sociolinguists now is to constantly critique, in a way that I think is often very unhelpful, people who talk about economics. And I think economics is something that we have to at least master some of the language of, because that is the language of public policy. That's what public policy gravitates around. Now, I'm not saying that we have to buy into the discourses. I think we have to undermine them. But the way to undermine them is by engaging with hegemonical policies, and these policies are made in the interests only of some categories of people. And so comprehensive policies are one way to do that. We actually did that through the Royal Thailand Institute, believe it or not, 10 years ago. And at first, their response to our requests was to say things like, oh, well, we really need to do more on English, or why can't we do these things separately? And of course, we know what the end result of those things will be. If you have one policy that's about improving the national competitiveness through investing in English, and another one that looks at the rights of tribal people or something or other, you know which one is going to get more attention in cabinet. So it's worth the effort to say to them, these things are linked by being language-related matters. Similar resources from universities go into them, and it would be good to try and include them in a comprehensive, unified policy. And that way, it's possible to peg down the dominant ones a little bit and push the other ones up. It's not easy, but then that's because we're facing extremely difficult, hierarchically organized social inheritances from the past. That's all I'll say. I hope that's useful.
Okay, so I think we mustn't be afraid to challenge powerful forces. That is the sort of key, yeah. And I think that's a sort of, I think, yeah, a good concluding point, yeah. I think there are still 69 people with us here, even after we have gone so massively over time. But I think we really have to bring this to an end, yeah. It's time for dinner in some places, and it's time for lunch in other places, I would assume. Okay. Okay. Well, on that note, yeah, I really would like to thank everyone, yeah, for coming here today. The speakers, yeah, for giving us your time, yeah, but also to the audience for giving us your time. Yeah, 2 hours and 45 minutes is a significant investment, and I really, if we should use a little bit of economic vocabulary, yeah, and I really appreciate that, yeah, that so many people stayed the length. Okay, so thank you very much, yeah, and we'll have to do something again, yeah. That's the key thing, yeah. We haven't said everything that must be said. Okay, but thank you very much. You will receive a link to the recording in your email if you registered. If not, you can write to me and I will send the link to you, yeah. If you want any of the slides as well, those will also be sent to you in the same email, or you can get them from me as well, okay? Thank you very much. Hope that you've enjoyed it, and it's been a great time to have you here, okay? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristof. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, panel.
Bye.